I never thought that being uninvited for my own son's birthday celebration would lead me to uncover the most heartbreaking conspiracy of my 38-year marriage. But when I decided to surprise him anyway with his favorite homemade cake, I ended up hiding behind the garden shed of his Millbrook home, listening to a conversation that would destroy everything I believed about the people I trusted most. What I heard through that kitchen window didn't just break my heart. It shattered my entire world into pieces I wasn't sure I could ever put back together. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. By the time I drove away from that house 2 hours later, clutching the steering wheel with trembling hands, I knew I was no longer the same woman who had lovingly baked that chocolate cake earlier that morning. My name is Patricia Whitmore, but everyone calls me Patty, and until 3 weeks ago, I genuinely believed I was living in a fairy tale marriage that most women could only dream of. For nearly 4 decades, Robert and I had built what seemed like an unshakable foundation together. We'd weathered every storm life threw our way, from raising our son David through his rebellious teenage years, to surviving the economic downturn that nearly cost Robert his construction business in Riverside Valley. We'd supported each other through my mother's long battle with Alzheimer's, celebrated together when David graduated summa cum laude from engineering school, and even managed to keep our romance alive through Robert's stressful midlife career change when he decided to become a real estate developer at 55. I thought we were the couple that proved true love could last forever. I thought we were unbreakable, invincible, the kind of partners who would grow old together on our front porch, watching grandchildren play in the yard we'd spent decades perfecting. Every morning when I woke up next to Robert in our cozy house on Maple Ridge Drive, I felt grateful for the life we'd built together, a life that seemed blessed by the kind of deep, authentic love that romance novels are written about. But I was wrong about absolutely everything. The beginning of my nightmare started innocently enough with Cassandra, my son David's wife of 4 years. From the very first day she walked into our family, something felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Cassandra had this way of smiling that never quite reached her eyes, especially when she looked at me. At first, I tried to dismiss my unease as natural adjustment anxiety. After all, it couldn't be easy for any young woman to marry into a close-knit family, especially when that family included a mother-in-law who'd been the primary woman in her son's life for 29 years. I told myself to be patient, to give Cassandra the space and time she needed to find her place in our family dynamic. I reminded myself constantly that building relationships takes time, that trust develops slowly, and that some people are just more reserved than others. I made every effort to include her, to show interest in her career as a marketing coordinator, to ask about her family back in Thornfield, and to make her feel welcomed and loved as David's chosen partner. But patience became increasingly difficult as Cassandra's behavior grew more pointed and deliberately hurtful. She started forgetting to invite me to family events she organized, then acting genuinely surprised when I showed up uninformed and unprepared. She'd plan elaborate celebrations for David's achievements, like when he got promoted to senior project manager, and somehow my invitation would get lost in the mail while everyone else in the family received theirs weeks in advance. When I'd try to contribute ideas for family gatherings or offer to help with preparations, Cassandra would give me that tight, controlled smile and inform me that she preferred to handle things her own way and didn't need any assistance. Thank you very much. The dismissals stung, but what hurt more was watching David navigate the growing tension between his wife and his mother, with increasingly awkward attempts at peacekeeping. Robert, bless his heart, initially tried to stay neutral and diplomatic. He'd listened to my concerns about Cassandra's behavior with the patient, thoughtful expression he'd perfected over our decades of marriage, offering gentle suggestions about giving her more time or trying to see things from her perspective as a new family member. But even Robert began to notice the pattern of exclusion, especially after what I now call the graduation party incident. David had finally completed his master's degree in structural engineering while working full-time, a grueling 2-year commitment that had required incredible dedication and sacrifice. When Cassandra decided to throw a surprise graduation party to celebrate his achievement, she invited Robert's entire family, her own parents who flew in from Thornfield, David's college roommates, and even some colleagues from his firm that I'd never met. But somehow, Robert and I, David's own parents, were completely left off the guest list. We only discovered the party was happening when Robert's sister called to ask what we wanted her to bring as a side dish. The confusion in Linda's voice when she realized we knew nothing about the celebration was almost as painful as the realization that our own son's wife had deliberately excluded us from one of the most important milestones of his life. When I called David to ask about what was obviously an oversight, he sounded genuinely confused and embarrassed. He promised to talk to Cassandra immediately and make sure we were included. But when we arrived at their beautiful colonial house on Elmwood Street the next evening, the tension was so thick you could practically see it hanging in the air like fog. Cassandra greeted us at the door with that same brittle, artificial smile, explaining that she'd had to completely rearrange her seating chart and that the dining room might be a little crowded now with the unexpected additions. Throughout the entire evening, she managed to make us feel like unwelcome party crashers who had forced their way into someone else's private celebration. That night, lying in bed next to Robert in our quiet house on Maple Ridge Drive, I finally voiced the thought that had been growing in my mind for months. Cassandra didn't just dislike me or find me annoying. She was actively, deliberately working to push me out of David's life entirely. Robert was quiet for a long time after I said it, staring up at the ceiling with an expression I couldn't quite read in the darkness. When he finally responded, his voice carried a weariness that I'd never heard before, and he admitted that he'd been thinking the exact same thing. But neither of us had any idea how deep her manipulation actually went, or how much worse things were about to become. Before we dive deeper into this story, I want to ask you something. If this story is hitting home for you, if you recognize these warning signs in your own family dynamics, please hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow, I have something even more shocking to share that every parent needs to hear. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in this unbelievable journey. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the life I thought was perfect before everything came crashing down. Robert and I met in the most romantic way possible, at a community theater production of Our Town in downtown Riverside Valley back in 1986. I was working as a dental hygienist at Dr. Morrison's practice, and Robert was a young carpenter trying to build his own construction company from the ground up. He'd volunteered to help build the sets, and I was there because my best friend Rachel had convinced me to audition for a small role. The moment I saw Robert measuring lumber backstage, his sleeves rolled up and sawdust in his dark hair, I knew he was something special. He had this quiet confidence about him, the kind of man who could fix anything with his hands and make you feel completely safe just by being in the room. When he asked me out for coffee after the final performance, I said yes without hesitation, and we talked until 3 a.m. about everything and nothing. Our dreams, our families, our hopes for the future. We were married 18 months later in a small ceremony at Riverside Valley Community Church, surrounded by family and friends who all commented on how perfect we were together. Robert's grandmother, a wise old woman named Edith, pulled me aside during the reception and told me she'd never seen her grandson look at anyone the way he looked at me. She said we had the kind of love that would last through anything life threw our way, and I believed her completely. Those early years were magical in the way that only young love can be. We bought our first house on Maple Ridge Drive, a charming craftsman cottage that needed more work than we could afford to hire out. Robert spent every weekend renovating something, and I learned to paint trim, install fixtures, and even help with basic plumbing. We'd work side by side for hours, covered in paint and exhausted, but so happy we could barely contain it. When David was born 3 years into our marriage, I thought my heart might actually burst from joy. Robert cried when he first held our son, this tiny, perfect human being who looked exactly like his father but had my stubborn chin. We were those new parents who took 1,000 pictures and bored everyone with stories about David's first smile, first word, first step. Robert would come home from construction sites covered in dust and dirt, but he'd always clean up before picking up our baby, holding David like he was made of spun glass and sunshine. Robert's construction business grew steadily over the years, built on his reputation for honest work and attention to detail. He specialized in custom homes for families in Riverside Valley and the surrounding communities, and his clients often became friends who recommended him to neighbors and relatives. I continued working at Dr. Morrison's office, but my real job was being David's mother and Robert's wife, roles I embraced with everything I had. We were the family other couples envied. Robert coached David's Little League team and never missed a game, even when he had demanding deadlines. I was the mom who organized bake sales and volunteered for field trips, who knew all of David's friends and their parents, who made elaborate birthday parties and holiday celebrations that became legendary in our neighborhood. Our house on Maple Ridge Drive was always full of laughter, friends, and the kind of warm chaos that comes from a family who genuinely enjoys being together. When David graduated high school as valedictorian and earned a full scholarship to Millbrook University for engineering, Robert and I felt like we'd won the lottery. We'd raised this incredible young man who was smart, kind, hardworking, and still wanted to spend time with his parents. Even during college, David would come home every few weeks, bringing laundry and stories about his classes and friends. He'd sit at our kitchen table for hours, eating my homemade cookies and telling us about his plans to design bridges and skyscrapers that would make the world a better place. Those were golden years for Robert and me. With David launched into his own life, we rediscovered each other as a couple. We started taking weekend trips to the coast, trying new restaurants, attending concerts and plays at the Riverside Valley Cultural Center. Robert surprised me for our 20th anniversary with a second honeymoon to Italy, where we spent 2 weeks exploring Tuscany and falling in love all over again. When Robert decided to transition from construction to real estate development in his mid-50s, I supported him completely, even though it meant financial uncertainty and long hours as he learned a new industry. He'd always dreamed of creating entire communities rather than just individual houses, and I believed in his vision completely. We used our savings and took out loans against our house, betting everything on Robert's new venture, Whitmore Development Company. The risk paid off. Within 5 years, Robert had developed 3 successful residential communities in the greater Riverside Valley area, each one known for quality construction and thoughtful design. We were finally financially secure in a way we'd never been before, able to plan for retirement and dream about traveling the world together. When David graduated from Millbrook with his engineering degree and landed a job with Prestige Design Group, one of the most respected firms in the region, Robert and I felt like our lives were complete. We had a successful marriage, a thriving business, a wonderful son who was building his own successful career, and a beautiful home filled with decades of happy memories. I thought we were living proof that hard work, dedication, and genuine love could create the perfect life. I thought we were the couple who would celebrate our 50th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren, looking back on a life well lived and a love that had only grown stronger with time. When David started dating Cassandra during his final year at university, I was thrilled. My son was 26 and had never brought a serious girlfriend home to meet us. Cassandra was beautiful, educated, and seemed to make David happy in a way I'd never seen before. She had a degree in marketing from Thornfield College and ambitious plans for her career. When David called to tell us he was going to propose, Robert and I celebrated with champagne and started planning the wedding we'd dreamed of for our only child. I remember thinking that our family was about to become even more perfect with the addition of a daughter I'd never had. I imagined teaching Cassandra my grandmother's recipes, shopping for baby clothes together when the time came, and having the kind of close relationship with my daughter-in-law that some of my friends envied. I couldn't have been more wrong about what Cassandra's arrival would mean for our family. But in those blissful days before the wedding, when I was helping address invitations and planning bridal showers, I had no idea that I was actually planning my own destruction. I thought I was gaining a daughter, not losing everything I'd spent 38 years building with the man I loved more than life itself. The first crack in my perfect world appeared just 2 weeks after David and Cassandra returned from their honeymoon in Santorini. I'd been so excited to hear about their trip, to see photos and listen to stories about the Greek islands I'd always dreamed of visiting myself. When I called to invite them over for Sunday dinner, a tradition in our family for as long as I could remember, Cassandra answered David's phone with a tone I'd never heard from her before. "Oh, Patricia," she said, and I could practically hear the forced smile in her voice. "That's so sweet of you to think of us, but we're really trying to establish our own Sunday routine now that we're married. You understand, right? We need to create our own family traditions." I was so stunned by the rejection that I hardly knew how to respond. Sunday dinners at our house on Maple Ridge Drive had been sacred in our family for over 20 years. David had never missed one, unless he was away at college or had a legitimate emergency. It was our time to reconnect, to share what was happening in our lives, to maintain the close bonds that had always been the foundation of our family. "Of course I understand," I managed to say, though I really didn't. "Maybe next week, then?" "We'll see," Cassandra replied vaguely. "David's in the shower right now, but I'll tell him you called." When I hung up the phone, I felt confused and slightly hurt, but I tried to rationalize her response. Maybe they really did need time to adjust to married life. Maybe Cassandra felt overwhelmed by our family's closeness and needed space to feel like she belonged, rather than feeling like an outsider joining an already established group. I decided to give them a few weeks to settle in before trying again. But a few weeks turned into a month, and when I finally called David directly at work, his response was even more confusing. "Mom, Cassandra mentioned you've been calling about Sunday dinners," he said, and there was something different in his voice, a distance that had never been there before. "We're just really busy right now getting settled. Our weekends are pretty packed with unpacking and organizing the house." "I could come help," I offered immediately. "You know how much I love organizing, and I have some extra linens and kitchen items that might be useful for your new place." "That's okay, Mom. Cassandra has very specific ideas about how she wants things set up. She's got it all under control." The way he said Cassandra has it under control felt like a door closing in my face. My son, who had always welcomed my help and input, was suddenly establishing boundaries I'd never encountered before. When I mentioned the conversation to Robert that evening, he listened thoughtfully but didn't seem as concerned as I felt. "Maybe she just wants to prove she can handle things on her own," he suggested. "Some women feel like they need to establish their independence when they get married, especially if they're joining a close family like ours. Give her time, Patty. She'll come around." But instead of coming around, Cassandra seemed to be pulling David further away from us. When Robert's birthday arrived in October, I called to invite them to the small celebration I'd planned at our favorite restaurant, Riverside Grill. Once again, Cassandra answered David's phone. "Oh, what a coincidence," she said in that same artificially sweet tone. "We actually made reservations at Thornfield Manor for Robert's birthday. David wanted to take his dad somewhere really special, and I found this amazing place about an hour away. It's supposed to have the best steaks in the region." I felt like I'd been slapped. Not only were they not coming to the celebration I'd planned, but they'd made their own plans without even telling us. When I tried to suggest that we could all go to Thornfield Manor together, Cassandra quickly explained that they'd only made reservations for 2, and that the restaurant was completely booked for weeks in advance. "I'm sure you understand," she continued smoothly. "David just wanted to do something special for his father. Just the 2 of them. Father and son bonding time, you know?" When Robert got home from work that day, I told him about the conversation, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of irritation cross his face. "She made reservations without asking us what our plans were?" he asked. "That seems presumptuous." But when David called later to confirm their dinner plans, Robert didn't express any of his annoyance. Instead, he seemed genuinely pleased that his son wanted to take him out for a special birthday dinner. "That's really thoughtful of you, son," he said. "Your mom and I can celebrate quietly at home." As I listened to Robert's side of the conversation, I felt a growing unease that I couldn't quite articulate. Something about the way Cassandra was orchestrating these situations felt calculated, like she was deliberately creating scenarios where David had to choose between his wife's plans and his parents' expectations. And David, eager to be a good husband, was consistently choosing his wife. The pattern continued through the holidays. When Thanksgiving approached, I naturally assumed that David and Cassandra would join us for the traditional feast I'd been preparing for our family for decades. I'd already ordered the turkey and started planning the menu when David called with news that left me speechless. "Mom, we're going to spend Thanksgiving with Cassandra's family in Thornfield this year," he announced. "Her parents really want to meet me, and since we spent Christmas with you guys last year when we were engaged, Cassandra thinks it's only fair." "But David," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "we've never not had Thanksgiving together. It's our most important family tradition." "I know, Mom, and I'm sorry, but marriage is about compromise, and this is important to Cassandra. We'll do Christmas with you guys, okay?" Except Christmas didn't happen either. 2 weeks before the holiday, Cassandra announced that they'd decided to take a Christmas cruise to the Caribbean instead of doing family celebrations. "We just want to start our own traditions," she explained when I called to ask about Christmas dinner plans. "You understand, right? We're trying to figure out what works for us as a couple." I spent Christmas Day feeling more alone than I had in 30 years of marriage, even with Robert beside me. We went through the motions of our traditional celebration, opening gifts and cooking dinner, but David's absence felt like a physical ache in my chest. Robert tried to stay positive, suggesting that maybe this was just a phase, that young couples often needed time to establish their independence before finding their way back to their extended families. But I was beginning to recognize a pattern that had nothing to do with normal newlywed adjustment. Every family tradition we'd cherished, every gathering I'd planned, every attempt I made to maintain our close relationship with David was being systematically blocked by Cassandra. She always had a reason, always had an alternative plan, and always managed to make it seem like I was the one being unreasonable for expecting things to continue as they always had. The most painful part was watching David transform from the open, communicative son I'd raised into someone who seemed guarded around me, like he was constantly monitoring his words to make sure he didn't say anything that might upset his wife. When we did manage to have brief conversations, he seemed distracted and uncomfortable, eager to end the call and get back to whatever Cassandra had planned for them. When Valentine's Day came and went without even a phone call from David, I finally admitted to myself what I'd been trying to deny for months. This wasn't about normal adjustment to married life or establishing independence. This was about Cassandra systematically removing me from my son's life, one holiday and tradition at a time. She was rewriting the rules of our family dynamic, and David was letting her do it without question. The realization hit me like a physical blow, leaving me sitting at my kitchen table staring at the phone and wondering how my relationship with my only child had deteriorated so quickly and completely. For the first time since David's birth 29 years earlier, I felt like I was losing him, and I had no idea how to fight for something I'd never imagined I'd have to defend. By spring, what had started as isolated incidents of exclusion had evolved into a systematic campaign that left me feeling like a stranger in my own son's life. Cassandra had become a master at creating situations where any attempt I made to maintain our family bonds looked possessive or intrusive. She had this incredible talent for making me feel like I was the problem, like my desire to stay connected with David was somehow unhealthy or inappropriate. The breaking point came when David got promoted to senior project manager at Prestige Design Group, the career milestone he'd been working toward since graduation. When he called to share the news, I could hear the excitement in his voice, the pride and joy that reminded me of the little boy who used to rush home from school to tell me about his achievements. My heart swelled with maternal pride, and I immediately started planning how we could celebrate this incredible accomplishment. We should have a celebration dinner at Antonio's, I suggested enthusiastically. Antonio's was the upscale Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated every major milestone in David's life: his high school graduation, his college acceptance, his first job offer. It was our special place, filled with memories of family celebrations and Robert's terrible attempts at pronouncing Italian menu items that always made David and me laugh until our sides hurt. "Actually, Mom," David said, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice, "Cassandra's already planning something. She wants to surprise me with a celebration, so I can't really make other plans right now." "Oh," I said, trying to hide my disappointment. "Well, maybe we could do something the following weekend then? Or even just a lunch to celebrate?" "I'll have to check with Cassandra about our schedule," he replied, and those words felt like tiny daggers in my heart. When had my son started needing his wife's permission to have lunch with his mother? 2 days later, I discovered exactly what kind of celebration Cassandra had been planning when Robert's business partner, Michael, mentioned seeing David and Cassandra at Riverside Valley Country Club the previous evening. "Looked like quite a party," Michael said casually. "Must have been 20 or 30 people there. David seemed to be having a great time." I felt the blood drain from my face. Cassandra had thrown David a promotion party at the most exclusive venue in town, and Robert and I hadn't even been told it was happening, much less invited. When I called David to ask about it, his explanation made my heart sink even further. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said, and he did sound genuinely apologetic. Cassandra wanted to keep it small. Just a few close friends and some people from work. She thought a big family thing might be too much pressure, since I'm still adjusting to the new responsibilities. "Close friends?" I repeated, struggling to keep my voice level. "Michael said there were 30 people there." "Well, you know how these things grow," David said uncomfortably. "Cassandra invited some of her colleagues too, and then people from my office heard about it. It just got bigger than we planned." The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. Cassandra had deliberately planned a large celebration while telling David it needed to be small to justify excluding his own parents. She'd managed to make me feel like I was being unreasonable for expecting to be included in my son's major life celebration, while simultaneously throwing a party that included people who barely knew him. When I told Robert about the party that evening, I watched his patient, diplomatic facade finally begin to crack. He set down his newspaper and looked at me with an expression I'd rarely seen, genuine anger mixed with disbelief. "She threw him a party at the country club and didn't invite us?" he asked slowly. "His own parents weren't invited to celebrate his promotion?" "Apparently it was too much pressure to have family there," I said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Robert was quiet for a long time, and I could see him processing this latest exclusion in the context of all the others. Finally, he shook his head and said, "This isn't normal, Patty. This isn't how families are supposed to work." But even as Robert's frustration grew, Cassandra seemed to be escalating her efforts to isolate us. She started what she called impromptu gatherings at their house, casual barbecues and dinner parties that David would mention casually in conversation after they'd already happened. "Oh, we had some people over last weekend," he'd say. Cassandra decided at the last minute to grill some burgers. It was really fun. When I'd ask why we hadn't been invited to these spontaneous gatherings, David would explain that Cassandra was still learning to entertain and felt more comfortable with smaller groups, or that they hadn't wanted to burden us with such short notice, or that it was really just a young couple's thing and they didn't think we'd be interested. Each excuse felt more insulting than the last. The idea that my presence would be a burden to my own son, or that Robert and I were too old to enjoy casual gatherings with people in their 20s and 30s, cut deeper than Cassandra probably realized. She was systematically redefining our family dynamic, establishing herself as the gatekeeper of David's social life, and making it clear that Robert and I were no longer welcome in the inner circle. The most painful incident happened in June when I discovered through Facebook, of all places, that David and Cassandra had hosted a housewarming party for their new home on Elmwood Street. I saw photos of the beautifully decorated rooms, the catered food, the happy guests touring the house that Robert and I had never even been invited to see. David's childhood friends were there, people I'd known since they were teenagers, playing video games in our basement. Cassandra's parents had flown in from Thornfield for the occasion. Even some of Robert's business associates were in the photos, raising glasses and celebrating our son's new home. But Robert and I, the people who had supported David through every challenge of his life, who had helped him financially during college, who had celebrated every achievement and comforted him through every disappointment, were completely absent from this milestone moment. When I called David to ask about the party, his response was devastating in its casual dismissal of my hurt. "Mom, it wasn't really a formal housewarming," he said. "Cassandra just wanted to have a few people over to see the house. It wasn't a big deal." "Your childhood friends were there," I pointed out. "I saw the photos on Facebook. Tyler and Jake and Sarah, kids I've known since they were 12 years old." "They happened to be in town," David said defensively. "And they're married now too, so Cassandra wanted to meet their spouses. It wasn't about excluding you and Dad. But it was about excluding us. And we all knew it." Cassandra had created a celebration that included everyone in David's life, except the two people who had been there longest and loved him most. She'd managed to make our exclusion look natural and unintentional while ensuring that our absence was complete and obvious. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Every gathering, every celebration, every opportunity for family connection was being filtered through Cassandra's preferences and priorities. She'd positioned herself as the arbiter of David's relationships, deciding who deserved access to our son and who could be safely excluded. And David, caught between his desire to please his wife and his natural love for his parents, was choosing his wife every single time. Robert's anger finally erupted one evening after I showed him more Facebook photos from yet another gathering we hadn't been told about. "This is ridiculous," he said, slamming his hand on the kitchen counter. "She's systematically cutting us out of his life, and he's letting her do it. This isn't what we raised him to be." I'd never seen Robert so frustrated about a family issue. He was usually the calm one, the voice of reason who could find diplomatic solutions to any conflict. But Cassandra's behavior was testing even his considerable patience and understanding. "We need to talk to David directly," Robert continued. "Not about Cassandra specifically, but about what's happening to our family. This can't continue." I agreed completely, but I was also terrified about what such a conversation might accomplish. If we forced David to choose between maintaining his relationship with us and keeping peace with his wife, which side would he choose? And if he chose Cassandra, which seemed increasingly likely, would we lose him completely? The conversation that would change everything happened on a sweltering Tuesday morning in July. Robert had finally reached his limit with Cassandra's systematic exclusion of us from David's life, and he'd decided it was time for what he called a heart-to-heart with our son. I watched him pace around our kitchen, rehearsing what he planned to say, his usual diplomatic approach replaced by a determination I'd rarely seen when it came to family conflicts. "I'm going to drive over to his office during lunch," Robert announced, straightening his tie like he was preparing for a business meeting. "This needs to be said face-to-face, man-to-man, without Cassandra there to filter everything through her agenda." My stomach clenched with anxiety. What if it backfires? What if he gets defensive and pulls away even more? "Then at least we'll know where we stand," Robert replied grimly. "I can't watch this woman destroy our family one celebration at a time while we sit here pretending everything's normal." When Robert returned home that afternoon, I knew immediately that the conversation hadn't gone well. His face was pale, and he moved through our house like a man who'd received devastating news. He sat down heavily at our kitchen table and rubbed his forehead with both hands before looking up at me with eyes full of hurt and confusion. "He defended her," Robert said quietly. "Every single thing I brought up he had an explanation for. When I mentioned the promotion party, he said it was Cassandra's surprise, and she wanted to handle all the planning herself. When I talked about the housewarming, he said they'd wanted to test out their entertaining skills on a smaller group before having family over. He made it sound like we were being paranoid and unreasonable. "What did you say to that?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. I told him that his mother and I felt like we were being pushed out of his life, that we'd gone from being close to feeling like strangers, and that something fundamental had changed since his marriage. Robert paused, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He got angry, Patty, really angry. He said that marriage meant growing up and establishing independence, and that maybe we needed to accept that he wasn't going to be our little boy forever. The words hit me like physical blows. Our son, the young man who'd called us every week during college, who'd brought his laundry home and sat at our kitchen table talking for hours, was essentially telling us that wanting a relationship with him was childish and inappropriate. "There's more," Robert continued, and I braced myself for whatever was coming next. He said Cassandra had been trying really hard to include us, but that we'd been making things difficult by being inflexible about traditions and resistant to change. He actually used the word resistant, like we were being stubborn children instead of parents who missed their son. I felt tears threatening, but I forced them back. "She's rewritten the whole narrative," I whispered. "She's convinced him that we're the problem, that our desire to maintain family relationships is somehow toxic or controlling." That evening, as if the universe was determined to twist the knife even deeper, David called with news that made my blood run cold. His voice was different, cooler, more formal than I'd heard since he was a teenager going through his rebellious phase. "Mom, I wanted to let you know that Cassandra and I have decided to take a break from family obligations for a while," he said, and each word felt carefully chosen and rehearsed. "We feel like there's been some tension lately, and we think it would be better for everyone if we stepped back and focused on our marriage right now." "What does that mean exactly?" I managed to ask, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to hear the answer. "It means we won't be doing Sunday dinners or holiday celebrations or regular family gatherings for the foreseeable future. We need space to establish our own identity as a couple without feeling pressured to maintain everyone else's expectations." The clinical language, so unlike my warm, emotional son, told me everything I needed to know about who had crafted this speech. This wasn't David talking. This was Cassandra's voice coming through his mouth, her psychological manipulation disguised as reasonable boundary setting. "David," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we're not trying to pressure you, we just want to be part of your life. We want to celebrate your successes and be there when you need support. That's what families do." "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need to step away from," he replied, and I could almost hear Cassandra coaching him in the background. This idea that family has some automatic right to constant access and involvement. Cassandra and I are a family now too, and our relationship has to come first. When I tried to point out that asking for occasional dinner together wasn't demanding constant access, David cut me off with a firmness that shocked me. "Mom, this isn't a negotiation. This is what we've decided, and we need you and Dad to respect our decision. When we're ready to reconnect, we'll reach out." After he hung up, I sat staring at the phone for nearly an hour, trying to process what had just happened. My son had essentially severed our relationship while making it sound like he was doing us a favor by establishing healthy boundaries. Cassandra had managed to convince him that cutting off his parents was an act of maturity rather than cruelty. Robert found me in the kitchen when he got home from his evening meeting with investors, still sitting in the same chair, still staring at nothing. When I told him about David's call, I watched my husband's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of resigned sadness I'd never seen before. "She won," he said simply. "Whatever game she's been playing, she won. She's got our son, and she's convinced him that we're the enemy." But Robert's acceptance of defeat only fueled my determination to fight back. I'd spent months trying to be understanding, trying to give Cassandra the benefit of the doubt, trying to be the patient mother-in-law who respected boundaries and supported her son's marriage. Where had that gotten me? Banned from my own son's life while his wife celebrated her victory. "I'm not giving up," I told Robert that night as we lay in bed, both of us staring at the ceiling and trying to process this new reality. "I don't care how clever she thinks she is or how thoroughly she's brainwashed David. She's not going to erase 30 years of love and connection with a few months of manipulation. What are you planning to do? Robert asked, and I could hear both concern and curiosity in his voice. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I'm not going to sit here and let her destroy our family without a fight. David is our son. We raised him, we love him, and we deserve better than this. The next few weeks were torture. No phone calls, no texts, no contact of any kind from David. It was like he'd disappeared from our lives completely, leaving behind only the echoes of 30 years of love and shared memories. I found myself driving past his office building sometimes, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, but never working up the courage to actually go inside. The silence was broken in the most devastating way possible when David's birthday approached in August. For 30 years, I'd never missed celebrating my son's birthday. Even during his college years, when he was hours away, I'd driven to campus with homemade cake or sent care packages that arrived exactly on time. The idea of his birthday passing without any acknowledgement from us felt like a betrayal of everything I was as a mother. Against Robert's advice, I decided to make David's favorite chocolate cake, the same recipe I'd been using since he was 5 years old, and deliver it to his house as a peace offering. Maybe seeing his mother standing on his doorstep with the cake that had marked every birthday of his childhood would remind him of who he used to be before Cassandra rewrote his entire emotional history. That decision to bake a birthday cake would lead me to discover a betrayal so profound that losing David's love would seem like nothing compared to what I was about to learn about my own husband. The morning of David's 30th birthday dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect August day that should have been filled with celebration and joy. Instead, I stood in my kitchen at 6 a.m., mixing batter for the chocolate cake that had become as much a part of David's birthday tradition as candles and wishes. My hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, creaming butter and sugar, adding eggs one at a time, folding in the cocoa powder that would create the rich, dark layers David had loved since childhood. Robert had already left for an early meeting with a potential investor, kissing my forehead and reminding me gently that David might not welcome my surprise visit. "Just be prepared for any reaction," he'd said softly. "Don't let it destroy you if he turns you away." But I couldn't accept that possibility. This was my son's birthday, and somewhere underneath Cassandra's psychological manipulation was the little boy who used to help me crack eggs for this very same cake, who would sneak frosting from the bowl when he thought one wasn't looking, who would wrap his small arms around my waist and tell me I was the best mom in the whole world. By 11 a.m., the cake was perfect. 3 layers of moist chocolate with the cream cheese frosting that David had specifically requested every year since he turned 7. I'd even bought the special birthday candles shaped like numbers that he'd always insisted on, though finding a 3 and a 0 had required trips to 3 different stores. Looking at the finished cake, decorated exactly the way I'd done it for 25 years, I felt a surge of hope that maybe this gesture would break through whatever wall Cassandra had built between us. The drive to David and Cassandra's house on Elmwood Street felt longer than usual, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say, simple words about love and family and the importance of not letting misunderstandings destroy 30 years of bond. I would be humble, I decided, acknowledging that maybe I hadn't adjusted well to the changes in our family dynamic while still expressing my desire to be part of their lives. When I pulled into their driveway, I noticed that David's car was there, but Cassandra's was gone. Perfect, I thought. This might be my only chance to talk to my son without his wife's immediate influence, shaping every word of our conversation. Maybe David would remember who he used to be when it was just the two of us, the way it had been for so many years before Cassandra arrived to rewrite our family story. I carried the cake carefully to their front door, balancing it while I rang the doorbell. When no one answered after several minutes, I tried knocking, calling out, "David, it's Mom," in case he was in the shower or had music playing. Still nothing. I knew he was home because his car was there, so I decided to try the back door. Maybe he was in their beautiful backyard garden that I'd only seen in Facebook photos. Or perhaps he couldn't hear me from the front of the house. As I walked around the side of their elegant colonial house, I could hear voices coming from the kitchen. The window was open to catch the morning breeze, and I was about to call out when something in the tone of the conversation stopped me cold. It wasn't just David's voice I was hearing. It was Robert's. My husband was inside my son's house, engaged in what sounded like an intense, private conversation on David's birthday morning. My first thought was confusion about why Robert was there when he'd supposedly gone to a business meeting. My second thought was relief that maybe he'd decided to join me in trying to reconcile with our son. But as I moved closer to the open window, still holding the birthday cake, I heard words that made my blood freeze in my veins. "The lawyer says we can file next month," Robert was saying in the low, serious tone he used for important business discussions. "I've moved enough assets to separate accounts that the initial settlement negotiations should go smoothly. Patricia won't be able to contest much since she's never paid attention to our financial situation." I felt like the ground was tilting beneath my feet. Robert was talking about our divorce, with our son on David's birthday morning. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was David's response. "Are you sure about the timing, Dad?" David asked, and his voice carried a concern that had nothing to do with his parents' marriage and everything to do with strategy and planning. "Cassandra thinks it might be better to wait until after the Riverside Valley project closes. That way Mom can't claim any percentage of the profits." The birthday cake slipped from my hands and hit the ground with a sickening splat, chocolate and cream cheese frosting spreading across the perfectly manicured grass. But I barely noticed because I was too busy trying to process what I was hearing. My husband was planning to divorce me. My son was helping him strategize the best timing for maximum financial advantage. And they were discussing it like a business transaction rather than the destruction of a 38-year marriage. "Cassandra's right about the project," Robert continued, and the casual way he said my daughter-in-law's name, like she was a trusted advisor rather than the woman who'd systematically destroyed our family, made my legs go weak. "But I'm not sure I can keep pretending much longer. Living with her day after day, knowing I'm going to leave, it's becoming impossible." "Just a few more months, Dad," David replied, and I could hear him moving around the kitchen, probably making coffee for this father-son planning session. "Cassandra says Mom's been getting more suspicious lately, asking more questions about family stuff. If you wait too long, she might start digging into the finances before you're ready." The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I had to grip the windowsill to keep from collapsing. This wasn't a recent decision prompted by our current family conflicts. This was a long-term plan that involved my daughter-in-law as chief strategist and my son as willing accomplice. They'd been working together to orchestrate my destruction while I'd been focused on trying to save my relationship with David. "I still feel bad about the way we've had to handle things with Patricia," Robert said, and the false regret in his voice made me want to scream. "She doesn't deserve to be kept in the dark like this." "Dad, you can't think about it that way," David responded firmly. "Cassandra explained it perfectly. Sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind. Mom would have made everything so much harder if she'd known what was coming. This way, it'll be quick and clean, and she can start rebuilding her life instead of fighting a battle she can't win." Cassandra had explained it perfectly. My daughter-in-law had been coaching my husband on how to leave me, while my son provided emotional support for his father's betrayal of his mother. The systematic exclusion from family events, the gradual isolation, the reframing of normal family affection as toxic behavior. It had all been designed to prepare the ground for this moment when Robert would announce his decision to end our marriage. But there was more, and it kept getting worse. "The hardest part has been acting normal around her," Robert continued. "Last week, when she was talking about our retirement plans and how excited she was about traveling together, I almost broke down and told her everything. She looked so happy, so trusting. 'You can't let guilt mess this up now,' David said, and his voice carried a hardness I'd never heard before. 'Think about how much happier you'll be when this is over. Cassandra says you deserve a chance to live authentically, instead of staying trapped in a marriage that stopped working years ago. Cassandra says. Everything came back to what Cassandra said, what Cassandra thought, what Cassandra had planned. My daughter-in-law hadn't just stolen my son. She'd orchestrated the complete destruction of my life while convincing the men I loved most that they were doing me a favor. I stood there in the morning sunshine, surrounded by the ruins of David's birthday cake, listening to my husband and son plan my emotional and financial devastation with the clinical efficiency of a corporate restructuring. Every word they spoke drove home the reality that I'd been living in a fantasy for months, maybe years. While I'd been focused on fighting for my relationship with David, a much larger war had been declared against my entire existence, and I'd never even known I was under attack. The conversation continued, covering details about asset protection, timeline coordination, and strategies for presenting the divorce as an amicable decision between two people who'd simply grown apart. They discussed my likely reactions, my potential legal options, and ways to minimize the disruption to their own lives during what they called the transition period. As I listened to them reduce my life to a series of logistical challenges to be managed, I realized that the woman who'd baked that birthday cake just hours earlier was gone forever. In her place stood someone I didn't recognize yet. Someone who'd been betrayed so thoroughly that she had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. I backed away from that kitchen window as quietly as possible, my heart hammering so hard I was afraid they might hear it from inside the house. The ruined birthday cake lay scattered across Cassandra's perfect lawn like evidence of my shattered illusions, but I couldn't risk the time it would take to clean it up. I needed to get home immediately and start figuring out exactly how deep this conspiracy went and how long I had before Robert executed his carefully planned destruction of our marriage. The drive back to Maple Ridge Drive was a blur of racing thoughts and mounting panic. Every red light felt like an eternity as I tried to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about Robert wanting a divorce. This was about a calculated campaign to ensure that I emerged from our marriage with as little as possible while he protected his assets and reputation. Cassandra hadn't just stolen my son. She'd helped orchestrate a financial crime that would leave me devastated and helpless. The moment I got home, I went straight to Robert's home office, a space I'd rarely entered during our marriage because I'd trusted him completely to handle our financial affairs. Now, as I looked at the neat filing cabinets and organized desk, I realized that my lack of involvement in our finances hadn't been about trust. It had been about naivete that was going to cost me everything. I started with the filing cabinet, my hands shaking as I pulled out folders labeled with bank names and investment companies I recognized. What I found made my stomach drop to my feet. Account statements showed systematic transfers of money from our joint accounts to accounts I'd never heard of, all bearing only Robert's name. Over the past 8 months, he'd moved nearly $180,000 from savings we'd built together into investments that legally belonged only to him. But the transfers were small enough and spread out over enough time that they'd never triggered any automatic notifications from our bank. Robert had been stealing from me slowly and methodically, taking amounts that wouldn't be noticed immediately but would add up to a devastating total by the time he was ready to file for divorce. In another folder, I found documents related to Whitmore Development Company that made my blood run cold. Robert had restructured the business 6 months earlier, creating a complex web of partnerships and holding companies that effectively removed my name from any ownership position. The successful development projects that I'd thought we owned together, the same projects David had mentioned in their conversation about timing, were now legally Robert's sole property. The betrayal was breathtaking in its completeness. While I'd been focused on trying to understand why Cassandra was excluding me from family gatherings, my husband had been systematically stealing every asset we'd built together over 38 years of marriage. Every day that I'd kissed him goodbye and told him I loved him, he'd been planning my financial destruction. But the most devastating discovery was hidden in a folder marked Legal Consultation. Inside were detailed notes from meetings with a divorce attorney named Harrison Blake, notes that went back over a year. Robert hadn't just been planning to leave me for months. He'd been working with legal counsel to structure our separation in the most advantageous way possible for more than 12 months. The attorney's notes were clinical and strategic, outlining ways to minimize Robert's financial obligations and maximize his asset protection. There were discussions about establishing a timeline that would allow Robert to claim our marriage had been irretrievably broken for years, reducing his spousal support obligations. There were strategies for characterizing our shared assets as primarily his contributions, despite the fact that I'd worked and contributed to our household for decades. Most chilling of all were the psychological assessments the attorney had recommended. Notes suggested documenting my emotional instability and controlling behavior to support claims that I'd made the marriage untenable. Reading those words, I realized that every argument we'd had about Cassandra's treatment of me, every time I'd expressed frustration about being excluded from David's life, had been carefully documented as evidence of my mental unfitness. I photographed every document with my phone, my hands trembling so badly that I had to take several shots of each page to ensure they were clear enough to read. This evidence would be crucial when I found my own attorney, proof of the premeditation and scope of Robert's betrayal that would transform what he planned as an amicable divorce into a criminal investigation. As I continued searching through Robert's files, I found something that made me feel physically sick. Hidden behind tax documents was a folder containing what appeared to be a detailed timeline of Cassandra's integration into our family, complete with notes about my reactions to various incidents. Robert had been documenting my responses to his daughter-in-law's manipulations, creating a record that portrayed my natural hurt and confusion as evidence of psychological problems. The notes showed that the systematic exclusion from family events hadn't been Cassandra acting alone. It had been a coordinated effort between her and Robert to create situations that would provoke reactions they could later use against me. The promotion party I hadn't been invited to, the housewarming celebration I'd discovered on Facebook, even the casual gatherings that David mentioned after they'd happened, all of it had been designed to isolate me while documenting my emotional responses for use in divorce proceedings. But Robert's notes revealed something even more sinister. He'd been sharing details about my reactions with someone identified only as C, obviously Cassandra. My daughter-in-law hadn't just been manipulating family dynamics. She'd been receiving regular updates about my emotional state from my own husband, using that information to refine her psychological warfare against me. Reading through months of notes about my behavior, my feelings, my attempts to maintain family relationships, all filtered through the lens of a man who was planning to betray me, felt like a violation so complete that I had to stop several times to catch my breath. Robert had turned our marriage into a surveillance operation, monitoring me like a subject in an experiment while pretending to love and support me. I found my laptop and began creating a detailed timeline of everything I'd discovered, cross-referencing bank statements with Robert's attorney meetings and Cassandra's escalating exclusion tactics. The pattern that emerged was horrifying in its precision and coordination. Every major incident that had hurt me over the past year corresponded with entries in Robert's legal consultation notes or money transfers to his private accounts. The realization that my husband and daughter-in-law had been working together for over a year to orchestrate my destruction while I'd been completely oblivious was almost impossible to process. I'd been living in a marriage that had become a criminal conspiracy, trusting people who were systematically planning my emotional and financial devastation. As I worked through the evening, building my case and documenting the evidence, I felt something I hadn't experienced since discovering Robert's conversation with David that morning. For the first time in months, I felt powerful instead of powerless. Knowledge was strength, and now I knew exactly what I was fighting against and who my real enemies were. By midnight, I had photographed every relevant document, created a comprehensive timeline of the conspiracy against me, and compiled a list of questions that I would need answered by a forensic accountant and a criminal attorney. Robert's carefully planned surprise attack was about to become his worst nightmare, because the wife he'd underestimated and betrayed was about to fight back with every weapon his own arrogance had provided. When Robert came home from what he'd claimed was a late business dinner, but which I now suspected was another planning session with David and Cassandra, he found me sitting calmly at our kitchen table with a cup of tea and a book. I smiled and asked about his day, kissed him goodnight, and went to bed beside the man who was planning to destroy me, acting exactly like the trusting, naive wife he expected me to be. But inside, I was already someone completely different. I was a woman who knew the truth, who had evidence of criminal behavior, and who was going to make sure that Robert's betrayal cost him everything he'd tried to steal from me and more. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. While Robert showered and prepared for another day of pretending to be my loving husband, I made phone calls that would begin to unravel the full extent of the conspiracy against me. My first call was to someone I'd never imagined I'd need to contact, a private investigator named Marcus Webb, who specialized in financial crimes and domestic surveillance. Marcus had been recommended by Dr. Morrison's wife, Janet, who'd hired him during her own difficult divorce 3 years earlier. When I explained that I suspected my husband of hiding assets and planning a divorce without my knowledge, Marcus's response was immediate and professional. "Mrs. Whitmore, what you're describing sounds like economic abuse combined with conspiracy to commit fraud. We need to meet today, and you need to bring every piece of evidence you've gathered." That afternoon, sitting in Marcus's modest office on Pine Street, I spread out the photographs and documents I'd compiled the previous evening. As he reviewed the evidence, his expression grew increasingly grim. "This is one of the most comprehensive financial manipulation schemes I've seen in domestic cases," he said finally. "Your husband hasn't just been hiding assets. He's been creating an entire false financial picture that would leave you essentially destitute after 38 years of marriage." But Marcus's investigation would reveal that Robert's crimes went far beyond what I discovered in his office. Using his contacts in the banking industry, Marcus was able to trace financial activity that painted an even more disturbing picture of systematic theft and deception. Over the past 18 months, Robert had opened 7 different accounts at 3 different banks, all in his name only. The pattern of transfers was sophisticated enough to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements, but clear enough to constitute deliberate fraud. "Your husband has been moving money in amounts just under the $10,000 threshold that would require bank reporting," Marcus explained as he showed me printouts of account activity. "This kind of structuring is illegal under federal law, and it shows clear intent to hide assets from a spouse. We're not just talking about divorce fraud here. We're talking about potential money laundering charges." The total amount that Robert had hidden was staggering, nearly $340,000 from various sources including business profits, investment returns, and even my own earnings from part-time work I'd done for his development company over the years. Money I'd earned helping him with marketing materials and client communications had been diverted to accounts I'd never known existed. But the financial crimes were only part of the story. Marcus's investigation into Cassandra's background revealed information that made my blood run cold. My daughter-in-law wasn't just a marketing coordinator with strong opinions about family dynamics. She was a woman with a history of inserting herself into other people's families and manipulating their relationships for her own benefit. "I contacted some people in Thornfield where Cassandra grew up," Marcus reported during our second meeting. "She has a pattern, Mrs. Whitmore. Before she married your son, she was engaged to a man named Trevor Blackstone, whose family owned a successful manufacturing business. That engagement ended when Trevor's parents discovered she'd been sharing confidential family financial information with competitors. The parallels to my own situation were terrifying. Cassandra had apparently spent months gaining the trust of Trevor's family, learning about their business operations and personal finances, then used that information in ways that nearly destroyed their company. When Trevor finally understood what she'd been doing, He broke off their engagement, but not before Cassandra had caused significant damage to his family's relationships and financial stability. There's more, Marcus continued, consulting his notes. I found records of similar patterns in 2 other relationships before Trevor. Cassandra seems to target men from successful families, particularly those with complicated family businesses or substantial assets. She specializes in creating division between parents and their adult children, then positioning herself as the voice of reason, who can help resolve the conflicts she's created. The revelation that I'd been targeted by a professional manipulator rather than simply dealing with a difficult daughter-in-law was both validating and horrifying. Everything I'd experienced, the systematic exclusion, the gradual isolation, the reframing of normal family affection as toxic behavior, had been techniques Cassandra had refined through practice on other families. But Marcus's most devastating discovery came when he traced Cassandra's current employment history. She wasn't just working as a marketing coordinator at a small firm in Riverside Valley. She was employed by Pinnacle Strategic Communications, a company that specialized in reputation management and crisis communications for high-net-worth individuals going through contentious divorces. Your daughter-in-law is literally a professional at helping wealthy people destroy their spouse's credibility and financial standing during divorce proceedings, Marcus explained. The techniques she's been using on your family aren't just personal manipulation. They're professional strategies she's learned through her work with other divorce cases. The implications were staggering. Cassandra had brought professional-level psychological warfare techniques into her marriage with David, using her specialized knowledge to orchestrate my destruction with surgical precision. Every exclusion from family events, every reframing of my emotional reactions, every strategy for isolating me from support systems had been drawn from her professional experience helping other people destroy their family relationships. Marcus also uncovered evidence that Cassandra's involvement with Robert went deeper than I'd imagined. Phone records showed that she'd been in direct contact with my husband for over 14 months, long before their conversations could be explained as normal family communication. The frequency and duration of their calls suggested a level of intimacy and conspiracy that went far beyond a father-in-law seeking advice from his son's wife. Look at this pattern, Marcus said, pointing to highlighted entries on phone records. Every major financial transfer Robert made corresponds with calls from Cassandra within 24 to 48 hours. She wasn't just supporting his decision to leave you, she was actively directing his asset-hiding strategies. The evidence suggested that Cassandra had been coaching Robert on specific techniques for financial manipulation, drawing on her professional knowledge of how divorce settlements could be influenced by the strategic hiding and restructuring of assets. My daughter-in-law had essentially turned my husband into her client, helping him prepare for a divorce using the same methods she'd learned from working with other wealthy individuals who wanted to cheat their spouses. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came when Marcus traced Cassandra's communications with other members of my extended family and social circle. She'd been conducting what amounted to a public relations campaign against me for over a year, sharing carefully crafted narratives about my behavior with anyone who would listen. She contacted your sister-in-law Linda 6 months ago, Marcus reported, showing me phone records. According to Linda, Cassandra called to express concern about your mental health and asked for advice about how to handle what she described as your increasingly erratic behavior at family gatherings. Cassandra had also reached out to my longtime friend and neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, supposedly to ask for guidance about managing family conflict, but actually to plant seeds of doubt about my emotional stability. She'd even contacted Dr. Morrison's office, claiming to be concerned about my well-being and asking whether there were signs of cognitive decline that family members should watch for. The systematic nature of Cassandra's campaign to undermine my reputation was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. She'd been working to isolate me not just from David and Robert, but from my entire support network, ensuring that when Robert finally announced his decision to divorce me, I'd have nowhere to turn for help or validation. The good news, Marcus said as he finished his presentation of evidence, is that your daughter-in-law's professional background also means we can prove that this was a calculated conspiracy rather than a family dispute that got out of hand. When someone with her specialized knowledge systematically destroys a family using professional techniques, it becomes a criminal matter rather than a civil one. The evidence Marcus had gathered transformed my understanding of what I was fighting against. This wasn't just a personal betrayal by people I'd loved and trusted. It was a professional-level operation designed to destroy my life and leave me with no resources to fight back. Cassandra had turned her marriage to my son into a business opportunity, using her specialized skills to help Robert commit crimes that would have left me devastated and helpless. But now I understood exactly what I was dealing with, and I had evidence that would expose every aspect of their conspiracy. The woman they'd underestimated and tried to destroy was about to show them what happened when they targeted someone who refused to be their victim. Armed with Marcus Webb's devastating evidence and the knowledge that I was dealing with a professional-level conspiracy, I knew that my response had to be equally strategic and comprehensive. The naive woman who'd baked birthday cakes and trusted her family completely was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that survival required playing the same game Robert and Cassandra had been playing, except I was going to play it better. My first call was to Sarah Chen, the most aggressive family law attorney in Riverside Valley. Sarah had built her reputation destroying husbands who thought they could outsmart their wives during divorce proceedings, and her initial consultation fee of $500 for 2 hours was worth every penny for the education I received about what we were really dealing with. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sarah said after reviewing Marcus's evidence, "what your husband and daughter-in-law have done goes far beyond typical divorce fraud. The systematic nature of the financial crimes, combined with the professional manipulation techniques, creates liability under both state and federal law. We're not just going to fight for a fair divorce settlement. We're going to destroy them financially and legally." Sarah's strategy was multi-pronged and designed to attack every aspect of Robert and Cassandra's conspiracy simultaneously. First, we would file criminal complaints with both state and federal authorities for the financial crimes, including money laundering charges for the structured transfers and conspiracy charges for their coordinated efforts to defraud me. The evidence Marcus had gathered was solid enough to guarantee criminal prosecutions that could result in prison time for both of them. Second, we would pursue civil lawsuits not just against Robert for divorce fraud, but against Cassandra for professional misconduct, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Since she'd used her professional skills from Pinnacle Strategic Communications to orchestrate the destruction of my family, we could hold both her and her employer liable for damages. "The beauty of this approach," Sarah explained, "is that we're going to make their conspiracy so expensive and so public that they'll wish they'd never heard your name. By the time we're finished, Robert's business reputation will be destroyed, Cassandra's professional career will be over, and your son will have to face the reality of exactly what kind of people he's been supporting." But before we could execute this legal strategy, I needed to secure evidence that Robert hadn't yet discovered I possessed, and protect myself from any retaliation once they realized I was fighting back. Sarah recommended that I continue acting normally for another week while we prepared what she called shock and awe filings that would hit them with multiple legal actions simultaneously. "The goal is to overwhelm them before they can implement any defensive strategies," Sarah explained. "Right now they think you're a naive victim who doesn't understand what's happening. We're going to use that assumption against them until the moment we destroy it completely." During that week of continued pretense, I made discoveries that reinforced just how deep their betrayal ran. Robert's behavior at home became even more unbearable once I understood what he was really doing. Every kiss goodbye became a mockery. Every conversation about our future plans felt like psychological torture. And every time he asked about my day or pretended to care about my feelings, I had to fight the urge to confront him with everything I knew. But the performance was worth it because it allowed me to gather additional evidence. I installed recording software on my phone and began documenting every conversation where Robert or David made comments that revealed their ongoing conspiracy. I also started photographing new documents as Robert added them to his files, including updated legal strategies and revised asset valuations that showed the scope of what he was trying to steal. The most damaging evidence came when I overheard a phone conversation between Robert and David about what they called Patricia management strategies for the period immediately after the divorce announcement. They discussed ways to control my emotional reactions, limit my access to information, and prevent me from hiring effective legal representation. "We need to keep her isolated and confused for at least the first few weeks," Robert said during a call he thought I couldn't hear from our bedroom. "Cassandra says the key is to overwhelm her with false sympathy while making sure she doesn't have time to think clearly about her options." They were planning to weaponize my emotional state against me, using my grief and shock as tools to manipulate me into accepting an unfair settlement. The clinical nature of their planning, discussing my anticipated reactions like I was a test subject rather than a human being they'd supposedly loved, made me realize that I was dealing with people who had no conscience whatsoever. On Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after my meeting with Sarah Chen, we executed our coordinated legal assault with precision that would have impressed military strategists. At 9 a.m., federal agents arrived at Robert's office with search warrants for his business and personal financial records. At 9:15 a.m., state police served him with arrest warrants for money laundering and conspiracy to commit fraud. At 9:30 a.m., civil process servers delivered lawsuit papers that named both Robert and Cassandra as defendants in multiple civil actions. Simultaneously, federal agents served search warrants at Cassandra's workplace, seizing computers and files related to her professional work with divorce clients. Her employer, Pinnacle Strategic Communications, was also served with subpoenas for all records related to Cassandra's activities and any communications she'd had with clients about family manipulation strategies. By 10 a.m., both Robert and Cassandra were in federal custody, their professional reputations were in ruins, and news of their arrests was spreading through Riverside Valley's business and social communities like wildfire. The conspiracy they'd spent months carefully constructing was destroyed in less than 2 hours. My phone started ringing almost immediately as the news spread. Linda, Robert's sister-in-law, called in shock and confusion, having just learned from news reports that her brother-in-law had been arrested for financial crimes. Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor, called to apologize for any conversations she'd had with Cassandra about my supposed mental health issues, now understanding that she'd been manipulated by a professional con artist. But the call I'd been dreading came at noon, when David contacted me for the first time in weeks. His voice was shaking with what sounded like a mixture of anger and panic. "Mom, what have you done?" he demanded without any greeting. "Dad's been arrested, Cassandra's being held for questioning, and there are FBI agents going through our house. How could you do this to our family?" The irony of David accusing me of destroying our family after everything he'd participated in was so profound that I almost laughed. Instead, I responded with a calmness that surprised even me. "David, I didn't do anything to our family. Your father and your wife did this when they decided to commit federal crimes against me while you helped them plan it. Everything that's happening to them now is the consequence of their own choices." "You don't understand," David continued desperately. "This will destroy Dad's business, ruin Cassandra's career, tear apart everything we've built. There has to be another way to handle this." "There was another way," I replied. "Your father could have asked for a divorce honestly, instead of stealing from me and conspiring with your wife to destroy my life. Cassandra could have focused on building her own family instead of systematically dismantling mine. And you could have supported your mother instead of helping them plan my destruction." When David realized that I knew about his involvement in their conspiracy, the call ended abruptly. Within an hour, Sarah received a call from a high-powered criminal defense attorney representing both Robert and Cassandra, asking about possible plea negotiations. "They want a deal," Sarah told me with satisfaction, "which means they know exactly how much trouble they're in and how strong our evidence is. But we're not dealing yet. First, they're going to face the full consequences of what they've done. Then, if they want to minimize their prison sentences and financial penalties, they can start by admitting everything publicly and paying every penny they stole, plus punitive damages. For the first time in months, I felt like I was the one with power in this situation. The people who'd tried to destroy me were now facing criminal prosecution, financial ruin, and public humiliation. Their carefully planned conspiracy had become the instrument of their own destruction, and I was the one holding all the cards. The woman they'd underestimated and betrayed was about to show them that sometimes the victim fights back harder than the perpetrators ever imagined possible. The federal courthouse in downtown Riverside Valley had never seen a case quite like the one that would dominate its dockets for the next 6 months. What started as a marriage dissolution had exploded into a multi-defendant criminal conspiracy that drew media attention from across the region and turned our family's private betrayal into a public spectacle that would define how the community viewed white-collar crime and domestic abuse. Robert's first court appearance was everything I'd hoped it would be. Watching my husband of 38 years stand before a federal judge in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed behind his back, provided a satisfaction so profound that I had to remind myself to maintain a composed expression for the cameras. The man who'd spent months planning my destruction now looked small and defeated, his carefully cultivated image as a successful businessman replaced by the reality of someone who'd committed federal crimes for personal gain. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Martinez, presented evidence that painted a picture of systematic financial fraud that went far beyond typical divorce misconduct. Your Honor, she argued during Robert's bail hearing, the defendant's crimes show a level of premeditation and sophistication that poses a significant flight risk. He spent over a year moving assets to hidden accounts, structuring transactions to avoid federal reporting requirements, and coordinating with co-conspirators to defraud his wife of her legitimate marital property. Robert's defense attorney, an expensive criminal lawyer named Thomas Crawford, tried to minimize the charges by characterizing them as a civil dispute that had been unnecessarily criminalized. But Judge Patricia Hendricks was having none of it. Mr. Crawford, your client didn't just hide assets during a divorce. He systematically laundered money through multiple accounts while conspiring with others to document his wife's emotional reactions for use against her. This isn't a marital disagreement. It's an organized criminal enterprise. Bail was set at $250,000, secured against Robert's business assets, effectively freezing his access to the money he'd tried to steal from me. Watching him realize that his own crimes had trapped him financially was almost as satisfying as seeing him in handcuffs. Cassandra's legal situation was even more precarious because her professional background made her actions particularly egregious in the eyes of the court. During her arraignment, federal prosecutor Martinez described how Cassandra had used her specialized knowledge of psychological manipulation to destroy my family relationships while coaching Robert on financial fraud techniques. The defendant didn't just marry into this family. She infiltrated it with the specific intent of exploiting their relationships and resources, Martinez argued. Evidence shows she's done this before with other families, using her professional training to identify and destroy the emotional bonds that hold families together. This isn't just conspiracy to commit fraud. It's predatory behavior that targets the most fundamental human relationships. Cassandra's attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Rebecca Stone, tried to portray her client as a naive young wife who'd been manipulated by her older, more experienced father-in-law. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Phone records showed Cassandra initiating most of the planning conversations with Robert. Financial documents revealed her detailed knowledge of asset-hiding strategies that could only come from professional experience. Most damaging of all were recordings of conversations where Cassandra discussed her previous successes in, quote, managing difficult family dynamics for other clients. The media coverage was intense and unforgiving. Local television stations ran nightly updates on the Whitmore conspiracy as reporters dubbed the case. Newspaper articles detailed the sophisticated financial crimes and psychological manipulation tactics that had been used against me. Social media exploded with discussions about domestic abuse, family manipulation, and the vulnerability of older women to financial exploitation by people they trusted. But the most devastating coverage came when investigative reporters began digging into Cassandra's professional background and her employer, Pinnacle Strategic Communications. What they discovered was a company that specialized in what they euphemistically called reputation management, but which was actually a sophisticated operation that helped wealthy individuals destroy their spouses during contentious divorces. Pinnacle Strategic has been operating as a criminal enterprise disguised as a public relations firm, reported Channel 7's investigative team. Internal documents show they've been training employees in psychological manipulation techniques, specifically designed to help clients hide assets and discredit their spouses during divorce proceedings. Cassandra Whitmore wasn't a rogue employee. She was using techniques the company had systematically developed. The scandal expanded beyond our family when federal investigators discovered that Pinnacle Strategic had been involved in dozens of similar cases across multiple states. Other wives came forward with stories eerily similar to mine: systematic exclusion from family events, documented emotional instability, and financial manipulation coordinated with professional psychological warfare. What I'd thought was a personal betrayal turned out to be part of a much larger criminal enterprise that specialized in destroying marriages for profit. The civil trial that ran parallel to the criminal proceedings provided an opportunity for me to testify publicly about what Robert and Cassandra had done to our family. Taking the stand in that courtroom, looking directly at the people who'd tried to destroy me while I described their crimes in detail, felt like the most empowering moment of my life. They didn't just steal money from me, I testified, my voice steady and clear despite the emotional weight of the words. They stole my family, my sense of reality, and my ability to trust my own perceptions. For months, they made me question whether I was losing my mind while they systematically planned my destruction. The financial crimes were devastating, but the psychological abuse was designed to ensure I'd never have the strength to fight back. Sarah Chen's cross-examination of Robert was a masterpiece of legal strategy. She forced him to admit to every lie he'd told me, every manipulation he'd participated in, and every dollar he'd stolen. By the time she was finished with him, Robert had essentially confessed to the full scope of his crimes in open court, while television cameras recorded every word. "Mr. Whitmore," Sarah asked during a particularly devastating moment, "when you were moving money to secret accounts, did you ever consider that your wife had contributed to that wealth through 38 years of partnership?" I thought I was protecting our assets," Robert stammered. "Protecting them from whom?" "From your wife, who had every legal right to half of everything you'd built together." Robert's inability to provide a coherent answer to that question said everything the jury needed to hear about his mindset and motivations. Cassandra's testimony was even more damaging to her cause. Under Sarah's relentless questioning, she was forced to admit that she'd used professional manipulation techniques on my family, that she'd shared confidential family information with Robert for strategic purposes, and that she'd systematically worked to isolate me from support systems. "Ms. Whitmore," Sarah asked, "you testified that you were concerned about Patricia's mental health. But isn't it true that you were actually documenting her normal emotional reactions to your deliberate exclusions for use against her in legal proceedings?" "I was trying to help the family deal with difficult dynamics," Cassandra replied weakly. "By difficult dynamics, you mean a mother's natural desire to maintain relationships with her son?" Cassandra's non-answer spoke volumes about her true motivations and methods. The jury deliberations in the civil case lasted less than 4 hours. When they returned with a verdict that held both Robert and Cassandra liable for conspiracy, fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and punitive damages totaling $2.3 million, The courtroom erupted in applause from the dozens of women who'd attended the trial to support me. But the financial judgment, while satisfying, was less important than the public vindication of everything I'd claimed about their conspiracy. The jury had seen through every lie, every manipulation, and every attempt to portray me as an unstable woman seeking revenge. They'd recognized the systematic nature of the crimes against me and responded with punitive damages that would ensure Robert and Cassandra paid a price proportional to the damage they'd caused. The criminal sentencing phase would provide the final chapter in their downfall, and I intended to be present for every moment of their public accountability for the crimes they'd committed against me and our family. The criminal sentencing hearing took place on a gray November morning that perfectly matched the somber mood in federal judge Patricia Hendrick's courtroom. 6 months after their arrests, Robert and Cassandra sat at separate defense tables, their expensive lawyers having negotiated plea agreements that would spare them the uncertainty of jury trials in exchange for admitting guilt to the full scope of their crimes. Robert went first, standing before the judge who would determine how many years of his life he'd spend in federal prison for the systematic destruction he'd planned against me. The man who'd once commanded respect in Riverside Valley's business community now looked broken and hollow, his confident demeanor replaced by the posture of someone who'd finally grasped the magnitude of his fall from grace. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Hendricks began, consulting the sentencing recommendation that Sarah Chen and I had spent weeks preparing, "your crimes represent a particularly heinous form of domestic abuse. You didn't just steal money from your wife. You orchestrated a conspiracy designed to destroy her emotionally, financially, and psychologically. The court finds your actions especially reprehensible because they involved the systematic betrayal of trust accumulated over nearly 4 decades of marriage." The victim impact statement I'd submitted was read aloud in its entirety, detailing not just the financial losses but the psychological trauma of discovering that my husband had been documenting my emotional reactions for use against me in legal proceedings. I described the feeling of violation that came with learning that my marriage had become a surveillance operation, that every conversation about our future had been a lie designed to keep me compliant while Robert planned my destruction. Mrs. Whitmore's statement describes a level of emotional cruelty that goes far beyond typical financial crimes, the judge continued. The defendant's actions were designed not just to steal from his wife, but to ensure she'd be too psychologically damaged to fight back effectively. This court cannot ignore the predatory nature of these crimes. Robert received 42 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, and in order to pay full restitution plus punitive damages totaling $1.8 million. The judge also issued a permanent restraining order prohibiting Robert from any contact with me, acknowledging that his pattern of deception and manipulation posed an ongoing threat to my safety and well-being. Watching Robert led away in handcuffs while court officers processed his transfer to federal custody provided a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The man who'd planned to announce our divorce at a family dinner, confident that he'd successfully stolen everything we'd built together, was now facing the reality that his crimes had cost him his freedom, his reputation, and his financial security. Cassandra's sentencing was even more satisfying because her professional background made her crimes particularly egregious in the eyes of federal prosecutors. Standing before Judge Hendricks in a standard-issue jail uniform, her carefully maintained appearance replaced by the rough reality of someone who'd spent months in federal custody, Cassandra looked nothing like the confident manipulator who'd systematically destroyed my family relationships. "Ms. Whitmore," Judge Hendricks addressed her with a coldness that reflected the court's view of her crimes, "your case represents a new category of criminal behavior that this court finds particularly disturbing. You used professional-level psychological manipulation techniques to destroy family relationships while coaching others in financial crimes. The evidence shows you've done this before, making you a serial predator who targets families for exploitation." The federal prosecutor's sentencing memorandum had included evidence from the broader Pinnacle strategic investigation, showing that Cassandra had been involved in similar family destruction schemes in at least 6 other cases, across 3 different states. The pattern was always the same: identify a family with substantial assets and complicated dynamics, insert herself into their relationships, then systematically destroy trust while helping male family members hide money from their wives. Your crimes go beyond individual financial fraud, the judge continued. You've weaponized psychological manipulation on an industrial scale, turning the destruction of families into a profitable business model. The court finds your actions represent a fundamental threat to the institution of marriage and family relationships. Cassandra received 60 months in federal prison, 18 months longer than Robert's sentence, reflecting the court's view that her professional training made her actions more culpable than his. She was also ordered to pay $2.1 million in restitution and punitive damages, and the judge recommended that federal authorities pursue deportation proceedings since Cassandra's citizenship status was complicated by her history of providing false information on official documents. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Cassandra's sentencing was the complete destruction of her professional reputation and career prospects. The judge's findings of fact included detailed descriptions of how she'd used her position at Pinnacle Strategic to develop and refine techniques for family destruction, essentially turning her into unemployable in any field that required trust or ethical standards. The broader investigation into Pinnacle Strategic Communications had resulted in federal indictments against 12 employees and the complete shutdown of the company's operations. What had started as my personal fight for justice had exposed a criminal enterprise that had destroyed dozens of families across multiple states, and federal authorities were still identifying victims who'd been targeted by similar schemes. David's reaction to his father's and wife's criminal convictions was perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire process. Even after months of evidence about their systematic conspiracy against me, even after witnessing their confessions in open court, my son continued to blame me for the destruction of his family, rather than acknowledging the criminal behavior of the people he'd supported. 2 weeks after the sentencing hearings, David sent me a letter that crystallized just how completely Cassandra's manipulation had succeeded in alienating him from reality. The letter was filled with accusations that I'd destroyed his marriage and his father's life through vindictive legal action, that I'd chosen revenge over family reconciliation, and that my inability to forgive had torn apart everything we'd built together. Reading David's letter, I realized that some relationships are damaged beyond any possibility of repair, not because of what victims do to fight back, but because of how thoroughly manipulation can corrupt someone's ability to distinguish between truth and lies. My son had been so completely brainwashed by Cassandra's techniques that he genuinely believed his mother was the villain in a story where his wife and father had committed federal crimes against me. The financial recovery from Robert and Cassandra's assets provided enough security for me to rebuild my life completely. Sarah Chen's aggressive pursuit of punitive damages meant that I'd recovered not just the money they'd stolen, but compensation for the emotional trauma and years of psychological abuse they'd inflicted. The final settlement, including seized business assets and garnished future earnings, totaled nearly $4 million, more than enough to ensure my financial independence for the rest of my life. But more important than the money was the public vindication of everything I'd claimed about their conspiracy. The extensive media coverage of the case had turned me from an isolated victim into something of a local hero, a woman who'd fought back against sophisticated criminals and won. Other women who'd experienced similar manipulation began reaching out to me, seeking advice about how to recognize and combat the kind of psychological warfare that Robert and Cassandra had perfected. The restraining orders that prohibited any contact from Robert or Cassandra would remain in effect permanently, ensuring that they could never again insert themselves into my life or attempt to manipulate my perceptions of reality. For the first time in years, I felt completely safe in my own home, knowing that the people who'd tried to destroy me were facing the consequences of their crimes and could no longer threaten my peace of mind. As autumn turned to winter and the legal proceedings finally concluded, I found myself looking forward to a future that was entirely my own to create. The woman who'd been targeted for destruction by professional manipulators had not only survived their assault, but had turned their own conspiracy into the instrument of their downfall. Robert and Cassandra had tried to write me out of my own life story, but instead they'd given me the opportunity to become the author of a new chapter where justice, truth, and personal strength had triumphed over deception and cruelty. 2 years after Robert and Cassandra were sentenced to federal prison, I stood on the deck of my new home overlooking Crescent Bay, watching the sunrise paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and coral. The small coastal cottage I'd purchased with the settlement money was nothing like the grand house on Maple Ridge Drive, where I'd spent 38 years as Robert's wife, but it was something that house had never been completely and authentically mine. Every morning, as I sipped coffee from a mug I'd chosen simply because I loved its deep blue color, I marveled at the profound peace that came from making decisions based solely on my own preferences. The woman who'd once agonized over every choice, wondering how it might affect Robert's mood or David's approval, had been replaced by someone who trusted her own judgment completely and never apologized for choices that made her happy. The cottage itself was a testament to my transformation. Every room reflected my personality in ways I'd never been free to express during my marriage. The living room was painted in warm yellows and soft greens, colors Robert had always said were too bold for his taste. The kitchen featured an enormous island, where I could spread out art supplies and cooking projects simultaneously, something that would have horrified my former husband's need for pristine organization. Most importantly, there wasn't a single item in the house that belonged to anyone but me, or represented a compromise with someone else's vision. The legal victory over Robert and Cassandra had provided more than financial security. It had given me a platform to help other women recognize and escape similar situations. What had started as my personal fight for justice had evolved into something much larger and more meaningful. Within 6 months of the trial's ending, I'd been contacted by over 200 women who'd read about my case and recognized elements of their own experiences in the manipulation tactics that had been used against me. Many of these women were still trapped in relationships with professional manipulators, unable to articulate what was happening to them or gather evidence of the systematic destruction being orchestrated against their families. Using the expertise I'd gained through my own ordeal, I'd begun working with attorneys, private investigators, and domestic violence organizations to help identify and document these sophisticated abuse patterns. The foundation I'd established with part of the settlement money, called the Whitmore Family Protection Project, specialized in cases involving professional-level psychological manipulation and financial abuse within family systems. We'd helped expose 3 other companies similar to Pinnacle Strategic, assisted in 47 criminal prosecutions of conspirators who targeted vulnerable family members, and recovered over $12 million in stolen assets for women who'd been systematically defrauded by people they'd trusted. But perhaps the most rewarding aspect of my new work was the support groups I facilitated for women who were rebuilding their lives after escaping family manipulation. Every Tuesday evening, 8 to 12 women gathered in my living room to share their experiences and support each other through the complex process of recovery. These weren't just social gatherings. They were intensive healing sessions where women learned to trust their own perceptions again after years of being gaslit by professional manipulators. The hardest part isn't the betrayal itself, explained Jennifer, a woman whose daughter-in-law had used techniques eerily similar to Cassandra's to isolate her from her son and grandchildren. It's learning to believe your own memories when everyone around you has been convinced that you're the problem. These conversations reminded me constantly of how fortunate I'd been to discover the conspiracy against me before Robert could execute his plan to divorce me. Many of the women in our support group had endured years or even decades of systematic manipulation before finally gathering the strength and resources to fight back. Their stories of survival and recovery inspired me daily and reinforced my commitment to ensuring that other families wouldn't fall victim to the kind of professional predators who'd nearly destroyed mine. The media attention surrounding my case had also created opportunities to educate the public about sophisticated family manipulation techniques. I testified before state legislative committees about the need for stronger laws protecting older adults from financial abuse by family members. I'd spoken at conferences for family law attorneys about recognizing the signs of professional-level psychological manipulation in divorce cases. Most importantly, I'd appeared on national television programs to warn other families about the tactics used by companies like Pinnacle Strategic to destroy relationships for profit. During one particularly memorable interview on a morning talk show, the host asked me whether I'd ever considered reconciling with David, given that he'd also been a victim of Cassandra's manipulation. My answer surprised even me with its clarity and finality. I spent 30 years loving a son who I thought shared my values of honesty, loyalty, and family commitment, I replied. The man who helped plan my financial and emotional destruction while I was fighting for our relationship isn't that son. I can't reconcile with someone who doesn't exist anymore, and I won't pretend that manipulation excuse is choosing to participate in criminal conspiracy against your own mother. The question of David had been the most difficult aspect of my recovery. Letting go of the hope that he might someday acknowledge what had really happened and seek forgiveness required a level of emotional discipline I'd never imagined I possessed. But maintaining that hope would have meant remaining emotionally available to someone who'd proven himself capable of breathtaking cruelty, and I'd learned too much about protecting my own well-being to make that mistake. The last communication I'd received from David was a brief email on my 65th birthday, sent from a new address indicating he'd moved across the country. The message was formal and distant, expressing what he called hope for eventual healing, but no acknowledgement of his role in the conspiracy against me or any request for forgiveness. Reading it, I felt nothing but mild sadness for the relationship we'd once shared, and relief that I was no longer emotionally invested in his approval or understanding. Robert's death 18 months into his federal prison sentence had been reported to me by Sarah Chen, who'd remained not just my attorney but a genuine friend throughout my journey. The man who'd planned to destroy me had died of a heart attack while serving time for the crimes he'd committed against our marriage. I felt no satisfaction in his death, but I also felt no grief. Robert had died for me the morning I'd overheard him planning our divorce with David. His physical death was simply the completion of a process that had begun when he'd chosen betrayal over love. Cassandra remained in federal custody, with 2 more years left on her sentence and an immigration hold that would likely result in deportation to Canada upon her release. Occasionally, I received updates about her unsuccessful appeals and her declining health in prison, but these updates felt like news about a stranger rather than someone who'd once been central to my family's destruction. The revenge I'd initially sought had transformed into something much more valuable. A life built on authenticity, purpose, and genuine connections with people who valued honesty and integrity. The cottage by the ocean, the foundation work that gave meaning to my days, the support groups that reminded me weekly of the strength humans could find in their darkest moments, all of it had grown from the ashes of what Robert and Cassandra had tried to destroy. Standing on my deck that morning, watching seagulls dive for fish in the crystal-clear water, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that devastating discovery in David's kitchen to this moment of complete peace and purpose. The woman who'd baked birthday cakes and yearned for family acceptance was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real love never requires you to accept abuse or betray your own truth. The settlement money would last for the rest of my life, but more importantly, I discovered that I was capable of creating wealth, meaning, and connection entirely on my own terms. At 67, I was finally living as the person I'd always been underneath the roles of wife and mother, someone strong enough to fight professional criminals, compassionate enough to help other women escape similar traps, and wise enough to build a future based on her own values rather than other people's expectations. As I finished my coffee and prepared to start another day of foundation work, I smiled at the irony of how completely Robert and Cassandra's plan had backfired. They'd tried to write me out of my own life story, but instead they'd freed me to become the author of something far better than anything I'd ever experienced during my marriage. The woman they'd attempted to destroy had become someone more powerful, more authentic, and infinitely happier than the person they'd targeted for elimination. Their betrayal had been my liberation, and that would forever be their greatest failure and my most profound victory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.